Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the session for building business plans and pitches for prospective investors. We know many of you are representatives from small to mid-sized biotech companies that are heading into some of your first investments meetings for getting funding for your companies. And today we're really going to focus on what are the key issues that you need to be thinking about and preparing for so you really have a compelling presentation, and what are some of the things you really should be watching out for to make sure you aren't sounding like a Me Too company or sounding like somebody who is not really prepared for investment. So today you have myself. My name is Jeff Stoll. I'm a partner with KPMG's strategy group. I am the national leader for strategy consulting in life sciences. I've been providing consulting service for over 20 years, and many of which has been focused with small to mid-sized biotech companies, but also large companies looking to acquire those companies. And then along with me, I have Jeff Katz. Jeff, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Jeff Katz here. I'm a senior manager based in Boston. I work in KPMG's valuation and business modeling services practice, where I focus mostly on helping companies develop, their equity story and realizing valuation over time with healthcare and life sciences companies.
So maybe before we jump into this, some context I think is really important for all small companies to really appreciate. And what we have here is sort of a view on the competitive landscape. So on the left side of the slide here, you'll see that what we have is the worldwide pharmaceutical pipeline. And this is everything from preclinical to phase 3. And it just shows you the sheer number of assets that are in development right now. And so you see there's a little over 16,000 assets in development, and a very large portion of those are biologics. On the right side of the slide, just to break it out, because we're going to talk about innovation a little bit, because that's a key part to really developing a compelling story for many of the young biotech companies out there, is just the range of types of modalities that are out there. And you can see that there's a pretty healthy range of engineered cell and gene therapy companies out there, antibody companies, and a whole range of other emerging technologies. As you can see, it's a very big landscape. And just to jump in a little bit more, and just to give you a sense of the number of companies, so this is just cell and gene therapy companies. You can see that across all phases, there's over nearly 1,000 companies that are just in cell and gene therapies that are largely small emerging companies. So it's a very competitive landscape out there, and it really, I think, merits the question, as you begin building out your business plan and thinking about your investment thesis for prospective investors, you should assume everybody that you're competing with for those dollars all have highly innovative science. And so it really raises the question, so how are you going to really differentiate yourself so you don't look similar to everybody else? And as you think about building out your rationale for your investment thesis, really the thing you want to make sure is you have a sound rationale for your portfolio strategy that is investor friendly. And so what do we mean by that? Well, investors are looking for companies that have differentiated platforms, but not too different. And I'll explain that in a minute, that clearly define the value that they're going to be driving for their investment. And as we think about that, there's several things that they're continuously looking for. One is what are the value inflection points? So is there a timeline where they would expect other investors, for example, to make another large investment that might change the valuation of your company? So thinking of a successful proof of concept study, successful phase 3, filing of an NDA, all things like that are examples of value inflection points. How long until your first value inflection points? Another important question. Is it 5 years? Is it 3 years? Is it 10 years? All those things are going to make investors think differently about your company and the type of investments that they think you are ready for. How long until your company will be commercial is an essential one. If it's 10 years, expect investors to want to make smaller investments up front rather than larger investments up front. Some may think you're too risky for their investment profile. So again, really being honest with yourself in terms of those timelines is really key. Really highlighting to the investors, what are the risks for your company? Are there competing similar companies out there with similar modalities? How are you mitigating these risks? Are you a single asset company? Or are you a multi-asset company? All those things will help them understand whether the risks with your platform, your company, are mitigated or not. And lastly, they're going to really want to know, are there any highly analogous companies, and how have they fared? So then that really brings me to that first point. While investors are always looking for companies that are bringing something new and different to the table, there is a bit of a risk that we've seen with some of the younger companies that if you are too different, you're so transformational that sometimes investors have trouble thinking about how to think about you and then how to place a valuation on your company. And sometimes, what really is needed then is to help them bridge and understand some analogous companies that maybe they're not exactly the same type of technology or you don't exactly have the ability to solve the same kinds of problems that your company does. But if you're able to help them understand how you may be analogous to some things that are out there, that will help them better understand your company. So again, very important to be, differentiated and have something that's truly innovative. However, sometimes that can also create other problems for investors, also then struggle to think about how to value you because you're so different and so disruptive. So really try to find the right balance between being unique and different, but also finding ways to help investors understand the type of value proposition your company might be bringing to the market and bringing to clinical development. So as we think about building your business plan and equity story, there are several things to really be thinking about that are sort of, I think, just sort of truths that everybody should have. And some of these are going to be obvious, but I think they need to be said because they don't always come across the initial investment decks that we see at KPMG from some younger companies. The first part is really be clear and concise in when you articulate your strategic direction and who you are as a company. Sometimes companies get so wrapped up in the science that they don't realize that many investors aren't going to have deep scientific backgrounds. So you need to bring it in at the right level and eventually build towards that more innovative story and what the science is really about. But start in some place that's fairly simple, and before getting into the more complicated areas of the science. Also really think about communicating, if somebody's going to make an investment, become a shareholder in your company, or an investment shareholder in your company, really highlight what are the value drivers and what are the key performance indicators and expectations that they should have along the way. So, are these dollars going to be used for filing an IND and finishing up a few more clinical studies to get there? Is this to help fund phase 1? Is it here to fund phase 2? What is the purpose of the dollars, and what are the expectations in terms of those timelines? And what are the things they should be looking for in terms of success? If you have a historical performance background because your company has been around a little while, make sure you really outline that historical performance and then what your future projections are, and make sure those things, there's some, common sense rationale for why those things are married together. Even if it means that you had some failed programs early on and now you're pivoting to a little bit of a different direction, help them understand how these things build upon each other and why it makes sense for your company to have gone from where it was in 2005 to where it might be now in 2021. And then make sure that your business plan really should serve both as a strategic document as well as a marketing document. And so I think what that means is, while you may have a larger version of your go-to-market document that's for your internal purposes to make sure you have your business plan, your key milestones, and all the different key steps outlined clearly, you should have a shorter version of that presentation that is a little bit more punchy and to the point, has good visuals, explains things clearly, has strong, sound financials, but maybe not, laying out all the minutia of the details and the assumptions behind those financials. Make sure you've got, maybe 15, 20 pages that really are clear and concise, that come in at the right level and aren't maybe in the minutia that your full business plan may have. But again, they should be similar documents that are very much aligned. And then lastly, really think about the growth potential and the risk assessment of your company. And that should be articulated in your documents also. So when we think growth potential, everybody thinks they've got the next blockbuster product. Sometimes that's true, sometimes it's not. And I think it's really important that you have done sound research to understand why or why not your product will be the next, multi-billion-dollar product, or why it will only be maybe a $500 million rare disease product, whatever it might be. Just make sure it's really sound and built up well. And we'll talk about some of those details a little bit later. So as we think about, on the right side of the slide, really some of the key components that get into how you go about addressing these bullets on the left side of the slide. There's several things that, and I won't touch upon every single bullet here, but there's several things that are really important to really nail. One is, making sure you're very specific to the total addressable market for your company. So if you have a multi-asset, multi-indication, make sure investors really understand how all that builds up. And really, if you are in triple negative breast cancer, make sure you're very clear about being in triple negative breast cancer, and then specifically what role or place in the care paradigm your therapeutic will play. So outlining all that and what the specific addressable market is to that very specific indication is essential. Oftentimes we see younger companies trying to overstate the addressable market by using a broader view of the disease area, as opposed to being very specific down to the indication and what that means for, what is the share of the market you're thinking of getting. I think that also gets into having a very clear understanding of what is the current standard of care and how you may be disrupted at that current standard of care. But depending on how far you are from being to market, you should also have a good view on the pipeline and what the future standard of care might be. And that is often where, again, we see small companies make a misstep, is they don't realize the degree that there may be, large and mid-sized biotech companies that have phase 3 or phase 2 programs that, very much could become the new standard of care by the time they're at market. So you need to have a point of view on that also, and why or why not those therapeutics are likely to be sufficient for that indication, and how either it may or may not disrupt the opportunity for your asset. Laying out all those details in your business plan are going to be essential, so investors, recognize why or why not your investment story is believable. Other key things they're going to want to look at is what are the realistic benchmarks for the development timelines and the capital you need for R&D. Again, if you're early stage, asking for 50 million to get you through IND in phase 1 is pretty common. Sometimes we've seen companies wanting 250 million. If you're asking for larger dollars, you better have a very clear, rationale for how all those dollars are going to be used. And why you're asking for a larger sum than maybe standard in the industry for earlier stage companies. So just be very clear, outline it all as best you can into all the details. Again, that doesn't need to be into your go-to-market deck, but eventually if you start getting investors who are serious, they're going to want to start seeing all those details and how you rolled up into those assumptions. Just talking a little bit about unmet need and how you articulate that in your presentation. Again, I think it's really important that you've done some sort of assessment on the competitive landscape. And again, as before, I mentioned before, if you are thinking about the current standard of care and how you may be disrupted the current standard of care, that's great to have that story together, but also make sure you got a view on the future. And I've shown triple negative breast cancer here because it's one that comes up quite a bit in the industry in oncology. And again, what we've seen with some of the smaller companies is they don't appreciate this landscape that I've sort of outlined here in bar charts. And you can see triple negative breast cancer is, maybe one way of thinking about it is sort of murderer's row of development. Now, that's not to say you shouldn't go after triple negative breast cancer. It's just to say, make sure you're very clear about the role of your therapeutic, where it would fit in the care paradigm. If there are emerging therapies that could disrupt triple negative breast cancer, is that disruptive for where you would fit in the care paradigm or not? Really be clear about articulating. Now, you don't need to do it for every single therapy that's in the pipeline, but certainly make sure you understand the key phase 3 assets that maybe have high likelihoods of success and maybe coming to market in the next 3 to 4 years. There could be really disruptive phase 2 assets out there. Make sure, again, you've thought about those too and how that would play out. You don't necessarily need to have that in your investment thesis and your go-to-market document, but you should have talking points related to that ready to go should a really savvy investor start asking you those kinds of questions. So just be prepared. These are sort of the key areas when we think about the equity story and this is your go-to-market deck that you want. You really need to articulate the reasons to believe in your company and in your platform. And so key things that have to be there, and I think most people know this, is what indications and markets are you going to play in now and in the future? Why does your science matter? And what is the clinical impact? Is it going to be doing something different that isn't happening today or may not even be happening tomorrow? Because you're that unique as a company. And so if you're able to talk about potentially bringing forward a functionally curative therapeutic, if you're able to talk about really changing the sort of overall survival time for cancer patients, whatever it might be, just be very clear on why it matters and how. And then when you think about the science, why is your mechanism of action different than what's out there? And if there's any similarities or ways of helping investors think about your mechanism of action that's maybe similar to other mechanisms that are out there, articulate that and help them understand how this might fit in or be similar to other things that are out there. So they again can start thinking about those analogous companies to your company. The other key point is to think about broader industry trends. that may be impacting your company that are either supportive or not supportive. So for example, as we watch the Biden administration, are there any new pricing policies that could be coming down the pike that could, have negative implications for the pharmaceutical industry? Make sure you have an understanding of that. You don't necessarily, again, need to articulate it in great detail in your presentation unless there is a specific policy that's either creating a market opportunity or going to be a significant headwind to your company, and you need to address it and how you might be overcoming it. Other key parts is really the strategy and reasons for winning. So, how is your company going to be disruptive to the market and unique to the standard of care, and transforming potentially the standard of care? And how does this translate to winning in the market? So really spell that out for investors. And the other key part, sometimes I've seen companies that are early stage, they don't appreciate whether they have a platform or whether they have single assets. If you have the possibility of showing investors that you have a platform where multiple assets will be coming off of your technology, lead with that and then talk about your lead assets. Don't lead with your lead asset. Platforms are ways of de-risking the investment in your company. That way investors know that if they invest with you, there is going to be more shots on goal for them to potentially get a return on their investment. So really make sure you think through before you walk through your investment thesis and build that out. Lastly, make sure you also think through how easy it is to administer your therapy and how that relates to the current standard of care. Sometimes you see innovative companies coming to market with an infusible product that's really well served by oral therapies. If you are coming to market in that way, your infusible therapeutic better be super transformative and justify the value proposition in that. There's some really, tough stories in the market. If you think about, for example, an area of gout, several years ago, there was an infusible drug for gout, really didn't hit the value proposition. And so, some investors really got burned with that. And, stories like that linger. And so they're looking for, is there truly an unmet need in this disease that would justify the route of administration and the complexity of the product if you happen to be a complex product? And then lastly, really make sure you think about your forecasts and they're defensible. And so what do we mean by that? Make sure you've got really accurate numbers on the treatable patient population, which is not just the epi, but really drilling down to where in the care paradigm and what is the number of patients that would be in your role with your therapeutics role in the care paradigm. What is that specific number? And then how does that then build up to the overall treatable population you're addressing? Make sure you've got some real research to support pricing assumptions, either using analogous therapeutics or doing payer research that would actually show that payers believe your target product profile would most likely merit a certain range of prices. Those are key things. And if, again, investors are going to want to know if they look at your product. Again, if you're pre-IND, you don't necessarily need to have all these things fully baked, but if you are in phase 2, you certainly need to have these things baked out for getting more investment. Also, in your forecast, make sure you understand the competitive market share. Don't just assume the standard of care, but make sure you have assumptions with where future competitive products are coming in and the timing of those fairly accurate, and what percentage of market you think those products will take. And then what percentage of that market will that potentially impact your product? And really try to be fair here. It can be a little, sometimes I think it can be a little bit disheartening to see how larger products that are later stage products are going to impact your market, but you need to build out those assumptions and have some facts for why that's going to be there. Otherwise, when you get to investors, the savvy ones will eventually rebuild your forecast anyways and include those assumptions. So the more you can be transparent on that and show that you're savvy about that will only engender trust in you as a company and as somebody who is aware of what's going on and how you're going to be successful in the market. And lastly, I would say the Ptrs rates for pipeline products is a key area that we see a lot of companies struggle with. Our recommendation is use the standardized published ones that are out there. There are many databases that have really strong Ptrs rates like Informa. There's the Tufts research that's out there. Use the standardized Ptrs rates out there. Don't cherry pick them. We often see that, and it's a place that savvy investors know is where people are going to try and improve the likelihood of success, which reduces the amount of discounting that's happening on their products in the pipeline. So, and I know Jeff Katz is going to talk a little bit about that, but it's one of the key areas that we really, really recommend that you go with the standard assumptions out there, because if you don't, again, it's going to engender less trust in you as a company by investors, and they're eventually going to revert back to the ones that they find. Jeff, I hand it over to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Jeff. So this slide talks about the business plan assumptions being sound, which Jeff talked about, and really PTRS assumptions being routed in standardized data sets and not cherry picked. So one of the main things that investors, investment bankers, and any third-party appraiser is going to look at in your valuation is your PTRS rates as well as your discounts. On top of that, they want to make sure that your forecasts are fully risk adjusted. They're using the DCF. So you may have revenue targets of $1 billion plus later out in the forecast period, but just remember that they're going to apply a number of discounts, and if your discounts that you've selected, in particular PTRS rates, are not with industry standard, they're automatically going to readjust your forecasts. This is an example here of mandatory discounts required for pipeline assets, and we did an example for oncology. And you'll see that we're showing basically the PTRS rates for all oncology and then all oncology with MABs. And we're doing this across the timeline. So you'll see pre-IND, IND phase 1 through phase 3, NDA versus BLA, approval, and then marketed. And you'll see that at each stage of the timeline, there are significant discounts that are being put into the forecast. And as you move from earlier stage to later stage, those discounts become a little less over time. But remember that there's at least 5 discounts that are happening in your PTRS rates, which will significantly drop the value. And then one other thing to think about is after you've applied the PTRS in your DCFs, you're going to have to also apply a discount rate of either a VC rate of return or a weighted average cost of capital. And this is another lever that'll be pulled and pushed on by investors and bankers if they believe that your forecasts aren't fully risk adjusted. And so typically what we see for large biopharma companies is around 10 to 20%, is around 10% and up to 20% for the preclinical biotechs. If it's properly risk adjusted, those forecasts. If not, the bankers and the third party appraisers as well as investors, what they'll do is they will increase your discount rate to basically triangulate a value that's in line with comparable market transactions. So it's just something to think about as you kind of get a basis for your valuation at your specific stage. One thing that's important is when you're thinking about valuation and how this ties into your equity story and the overall investor deck that you're going to put in front of prospective investors, is you're going to want to keep your expectations realistic and make sure you've done a lot of digging and market research on market comps. And so this slide here shows the highest valuations for IND stage biotech IPO valuations from 2015 to 2020. And it breaks it out between nucleic acid platforms and then all other biotech IPOs. What you'll notice is that the highest IND stage biotech IPO valuation was 1.8 million, which was a platform company that was also an outlier. But what you'll see is that most of these companies on the IND stage don't go over 800 million in valuation. And so just something to just keep grounded in when you're thinking about, valuation and potential investments in the company. You'll want to make sure that you keep your expectations realistic as, at the beginning in the earlier stage, right? You're not going to have some of the multi-billion-dollar valuations that you might think. And so it's also important to understand at certain inflection points, after certain phases you've passed, how your value might increase over time. And so these are just things to keep grounded in as you continue to go out to the investor community, and you're not shocked by specific valuations they place on your portfolio. If you're a phase 2 company or later stage, valuations can, depending on the actual market opportunity, your valuations are going to be significantly higher. They can be well over $1 billion. But again, it also depends on the market opportunity and industry trends. It all depends on that, but at the same time, there's a pretty consistent pattern as you move towards later stages, your value will continue to increase. And so as part of your equity story, you definitely want to touch on, this is what I think my valuation might be right now. But as we continue to see success and pass certain stages and we have more indications, it's more likely than not that my valuation is going to, this is the value you're going to get over time as we continue to progress. And one thing you'll also notice here on this slide is that platform IPOs tend to get significantly higher valuations. It's not always the case, but again, it's a way to it basically is basically a risk adjustment for investors and allows them to see that if they get more shots at potentially being successful. And then final thoughts, as we kind of touched on in this presentation, as Jeff touched on, you want to put a lot of time and effort up front to make sure that you have a defensible market and product forecast, because as you go into investor meetings, they're definitely going to really scrutinize those and how that leads into valuation. You want to be realistic about what your company and the pipeline assets will be capable of, and you want to be very careful with your PTRS rates that you're selecting. And you don't want to exaggerate them. You want to just build realistic PTRS rates into your forecast and your valuation that you can support with standard evidence. It'll go a much longer way with the investor community, and then there won't be a push and pull on the valuation as much as if you had different PTRS rates than what they would select. And then also, for your valuation, really keep them rooted in realistic market comps. So it's very rare that you'll see a pre-revenue biotech justify valuations north of 600 million. You might see some phase 2 and phase 3 that do, but the earlier stage, it's definitely very rare to see anything north of 600 million. And then lastly, can you clearly and concisely articulate the strategic direction of your company into a powerful equity story? Because ultimately, you want your investors to believe that this is the next great product and that your plan going forward is going to allow you to maximize value and give them a return on investment.
Thank you, everybody, for joining today. We are now going to head to a Q&A session.